Welcome, everybody, to PlayStation Vita. 10 years later, you can now feel old or wonder why your significant other or friend brought you to this panel. So first up, just real quick, just to see how much of an Uber nerd I am, I did bring my PlayStation Vita with me. Did anyone else? We got two? All right, that's two more than I also thought. Let me guess. Is that a Slim?
This is actually the OLED.
Okay.
3G OLED.
3G. All right, you got me beyond the 3G. And then hold yours up in the back. Which? Oh, we got two more. What's the blue one in the back?
It's the limited edition blue one that came out at GameStop.
Oh, so fun to hear. Well, that'll be our first trivia question. That was actually the last PlayStation Vita new SKU Sony ever made in the West with it. There's a really funny thing. I always wanted that system just for its box. It came out September of 2015, GameStop exclusive. It only advertised one game on the back. Does anyone know what PlayStation Vita game, September of 2015, they would have been advertising? It's not a deep cut, but it should be pretty fresh in your memory. No, that was May 2014. But close. There weren't many Vita Slim bundles in the West. It was actually Persona 4 Dancing All Night, because that had just come out. And of course, the color blue, very known for Persona 4. For all of you guys who came up with Vitas, if you want to steal, I have way too many Play Asia stickers. They are very nice quality. If you either shiny things or just want to steal them from me, you're more than welcome. I'm sure I'll have way too many left at the end of the panel. But so thank you all for coming to the panel and being, I assume, remotely interested in the PlayStation Vita. So we're first going to start off with the history of the system without getting too much in the weeds. And by the way, if at any point while talking you guys have a question, want to ask anything, challenge my nerdness for this, please feel free. We can Highlander this panel. So before we knew what the PlayStation Vita was, all we knew about was the next generation portable, because you can't have a system without code names and stuff. So the PSP was a huge success for many, many years. PSP launched in 2004 and sold millions of systems. But the problem with that was it never sold that many games, because it was a great machine to hack for a lot of people. I never actually hacked my PSP, but I'm sure anyone here remembers the days of people using the PSP a lot more. They were just like an emulation machine. It was super easy. Not a lot of games really sold on it because people, unless you were buying Monster Hunter and stuff like that, it was just a lot of, hey, I'm using this for blah, blah, blah. Funnily enough, PSP was my iPod for many, many years, because it had so many random apps. You could do comics, watch movies, you could Skype people. I actually used it primarily. I never knew anyone else who did this for podcasts. There was an RSS feed for PSP, and that was the one thing the Vita didn't have. And I remember using the RSS feed, and that's what got me into podcasts back in this is 2008 or so. So podcasts weren't really that much of a big thing. So that was a funny one for me. That's what really made me get into it. But Sony was okay, the PSP sold really well. We're going to learn from our mistakes. What can we do? And the fact that their whole takeaway from it was okay, we're going to cram as much into this thing as humanly possible, for better or for worse. And they had two different models. One was Wi-Fi only. The other one was 3G, exclusively with AT&T. So we can all make fun. It is funny. It's been 10 years. AT&T we would still laugh at that joke, even in 2022, for exclusively with AT&T. They're that synonymously bad for internet that it'd be after all of this time you would still think about that for it. But other little trivia one out there for anyone who wants to remember. Does anyone know how much the 3G model cost, or the Wi-Fi one? Yeah.
3G model cost $299 and the Wi-Fi model is $249.
Yeah. So at the time, that was actually really competitive pricing, because the 3DS had not gotten its price cut yet. The 3DS was actually more expensive than a regular Vita. So at the time, everyone was oh my God, this is great. You're going to destroy this thing, because the 3DS had no games, and the Vita had a lot more support than that. They didn't have Nintendo at the time. And the systems definitely, it is kind of funny. Most people would probably think the 3DS outlived the Vita, where in terms of games, the Vita definitely kind of had it beat. It just wasn't beat in terms of recognizable games and things like that. So the Vita did launch in December of 2011 in Japan with still a lot of games, and we got it in the West really, really early. Or if you remember, and also want to feel old, the Taco Bell promotion, you could get it like a month early if you bought like a $5 like chalupa box or something. And I remember one kid at my school got it, and I was like, man, that's when I knew. I made it that I was like a senior in high school. I was like, I should start eating Taco Bell. I could have had a Vita if I ate more Taco Bell in my life. That was my big takeaway. And it's been downhill since then. But thankfully not downhill. The Vita had a really strong start. It launched with a ton of games. It's, honestly, when I think of really diverse and out there launch titles, it had so many different games. Who here actually had the Vita at launch? Like, what are some like launch games you can think of besides like the one I listed on here, Uncharted?
No, that was all I played.
it was the Uncharted machine.
I was super obsessed with Uncharted, and then they had like, I remember at launch there were already some games installed that remind me of like the mechanics of Melee a little bit, and I forgot the name of it, but it was like because around this time PlayStation All-Star came out.
Oh yeah, well yeah, that would have been like for 2013 with it, but yeah, that was a big one for sure.
And that was installed.
Yeah.
That and Uncharted.
I know it's kind of like a joke game because it's like a tech demo for like their augmented reality, but Little Deviants was actually kind of fun.
That's one that like I own. I think I'm almost or a little over 400 like just physical games for my collection alone. Little Deviants and like Reality Fighters are like the only two like first party ones that are like, I'm okay. Those don't need to be in my collection. Like, and I have nothing against them because like they're fun tech demos, but they're never like ones that I'm like I should really check it out. But I'm sure like that's when I'll stumble across now at like $5 or like some really low price for it because I've never heard anyone say it's bad. It's definitely cool to check out. It uses some fun things with it. It was just sad too because I was like that developer's last game was Little Deviants. I saw a couple other hands for like any like launch games people remember or any things like that. Yeah.
Army Corps of Hell, I remember, was the launch game. That was the one I was funny enough excited for the most because I was a very edgy kid at the time. That
Well, yeah, the best part about Army Corps of Hell was, if anyone doesn't know, it was a Square Enix published game. It's literally Pikmin, but you're Satan. So it's like you're moving around hundreds of hordes of people. It's got an amazing soundtrack. The cover of it's really, really cool. And they just had so many crazy games. I remember Blaze Blue, the latest Blaze Blue launched on that one. That was a really big one. Escape Artists, yeah.
I'm sure I think quite remember it was a launch game. Wasn't there the port of Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom?
That was launched, yeah. Marvel vs. Capcom 3.
That was the game that showed me just like, because it was just like on PS3.
Well, what was funny about it, yeah, the port was amazing. Capcom had done that port internally for it. And Ultimate Marvel 3, there was actually, I don't think they ever actually patched it into the PS4 or PC versions. It had the most nerdy, like this is how, like devs knew the Vita was just for big, dumb game nerds. The Vita had exclusive hitboxes in training mode. Like the only way you could see where hitboxes were in the Vita one, because of course that's where all the competitive play was, but it was a flawless port. Like the only thing that's like funny about it that kind of stinks about it is they never relisted it. So unless you bought it back in, because it got delisted pretty quickly, back in 2012, you were always miss Shumagorath or Jill. But yeah, outside of that, like it's such an awesome port with it. And Capcom did a lot of really weird support. Like say what you will about like Street Fighter Cross Tekken, that's a really good port of that game on there. And that was the fun thing about it, like especially at launch, and the fact that PS4 and Xbox One wasn't out yet. This was a system targeting like PS3 360 quality like games, and it can run those at a pretty good rate. Other ones like Wipeout is a good one. Like Wipeout actually looked and played better than the PS3 one. There were so many crazy titles. Luminous was a good one. If you liked like rhythm games or puzzle games, like they just had like something for everybody on there, and it was just really good. Of like, I couldn't think of that launch of like what was missing. Like it had platformers, it had like rhythm games, fighting games, first party, big stuff, small stuff. And a fun one I mentioned on here is this is the last time we could really see it in the West of flexible pricing. So another little weird trivia one, Uncharted Golden Abyss, for example, was a $50 retail game. But if you bought it digitally, Sony was like, hey, you're getting it digitally. You don't have to pay the same full price. It was actually a little bit cheaper. So I think it was like maybe $44 or $45 for it. But this was, they started off by making games digital that were also physical cheaper because really there's no reason it shouldn't like be that way. And it is funny, the Vita is what started this, and because it completely failed at trying to sell most AAA games, no one ever adopted it. So we're still paying full price for physical and digital, all it is now. But really strong start. It sold really well as most consoles do in Japan and in the West as well. But of course, you can't have too much success without having a memory card problem. So as most people who've either been turned off or at least have owned a Vita will tell you, the rug got pulled out from under us at the last second. It was probably like a couple of weeks before the Japanese launch. We found out that the system had no internal memory. So you had to have, if you wanted to play anything, or save anything at all, you had to have a 4, 8, 16, or 32 gig memory card. And I looked up these prices earlier before making this panel, and man, I forgot how hilariously expensive these were. $30 for 4 gigs, $45 for 8, 16 was $70. That's like a PS5 game now, like without like inflation prices. And 32, I don't think I ever knew anyone who owned one, but 32 for 120 was a hell of a commitment. Yeah.
At launch, I'm pretty sure the 3G model came with a bundle that has little deviants and
Yep.
an 8 GB card.
That was actually a starter pack. You could get it a week early, and yeah, you got a bundle with a game, a downloadable game as well, which most people don't remember was Super Stardust Delta. That was another like really good launch game, but to be fair, 4 gigs went really fast for as small as the Vita game like memories were. I would also take it out of my system here. I actually never took mine all the way out here. I have the with me here the crystal white one that came with the Assassin's Creed bundle for the 1000. The little memory card slot is here, and anyone who has seen the memory cards will tell you it's like the size of your pinky nail. It is ridiculously small. They are thankfully not like horrifyingly expensive now, but they definitely started really pricey, never got an official price cut in the West, and in Japan, they at least got a 64 gig model that sometimes came to GameStops, who for some reason imported those in 2014, 2015. But the memory cards were an issue. They still are kind of an issue if you want to be upfront and legal about everything. But that one is like kind of, out of all the things you can ever say bad about the Vita, that's the one you can't really back up. It's like, yeah, that was a super boneheaded move to make it proprietary memory cards. They never made them cheaper. They only let Sony make them, so there was never any third-party discount versions or anything like that. Yeah.
I remember, so I actually, at the time, when I found out about the memory cards, I was a GameStop employee.
Mm-hmm.
And what a lot of people, or what a lot of store employers were not allowed to tell people at the time was, when you got the 32 gigabytes card, they sometimes gave people promo codes for certain updates for some of the games that were undetailed.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just like, I
the thing I always remember, because I also had worked at GameStop when Vita was like still really in its heyday, was the one thing everyone would always forget when selling their system was to take out their memory card, because that was a separate thing you could sell it. They wouldn't come with them by default. So the amount of times when I started at a store or would come to a store and it'd be like, oh, yep, someone left a 32 gig in here, someone left a 16 gig card in here. Just out of curiosity, does anyone remember what memory card they had with their system? Was anyone big baller with 32 gigs, had 64? Where are we at?
I got a 32 on clearance when the Vita was dying.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
I got one thing around 64 at GameStop one time, so.
Oh, yes. Yeah, that's a really, really good one. You in the back?
I got 64 gigs for 70 on Amazon.
Ooh, what year would that have been?
2016.
That would have made sense. I got my 64 working at GameStop, so I had like a 20 to 25% discount, and then it was like 80. And I remember like my boss was like, that's such a stupid move. Why would you pay $80 for that? Now looking for what the 64s go for, I'm very glad I did, although there is like a big asterisk to it. Yeah.
I got 8 gig, but it's because I bought a PlayStation TV like a couple of years ago for $35, which was already a steal, and the person left an SD card and the game inside.
No, I mean, yeah, at that point. You?
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I got 32 for about 40 gigs.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Yep.
I got an 8 gig and a 16 gig for only $10 at a pawn shop because I had no idea what they were worth.
I mean, yeah, there was like honestly, until like 2020, Vita stuff was just dirt cheap for collecting most of it. And the thing that sucked, though, because the way the memory cards work, without getting too technical, you can't just like hot swap them like memory cards. They're tied to a system and they're tied to an account. So like even though I have two, do I have two? I may have like 2 or 3. You can't just swap them out, so they have to be in, like I have 2 other Vitas at home and they're like tied to like, okay, here's my Japanese one, because you can't just like switch regions. So it was that thing of like, it sucked because you couldn't use them like most SD card memories. You couldn't just switch them out and like, oh, here's these games, here's these games. It was always like having to like swap memory around to like where things were loaded. It was like such a pain in the butt. Yeah.
I imported mine, 64 gigabytes from Japan in 2012.
Oh, nice. So I was trying to remember, do you know how much the 64s were when they dropped?
I got it off of Yahoo Auctions, so I don't actually know what the MSRP was.
Yeah, because it was, Japan got one official memory card price cut, which made it actually cheaper than it was in America, but Sony in America just kind of gave up on memory cards after launch, and we never got the 64 here or any price cut officially, which always made it such a pain in the butt of like, where do you get it? Should I get it? And the thing also that people don't remember, anyone in here with a 64 card, have any of your memory cards aired out or corrupted? Good. That's like the thing I always see horror stories of. For whatever reason, the 64 gig cards are only known, the other ones don't suffer this, to corrupt randomly. There's no rhyme or reason to it. They will just sometimes lose all of your memory, no warning, no nothing. It's normally known to happen after using them for about a year or so it's not like they're likely to happen now. But that was a thing I noticed a lot when I would be on Reddit for the, like looking at the Vita page. I'd see people be like, oh, my 64 card's gone. All your saves, unless you've backed everything up, you're just totally like SOL there, and it made it like so painful. But yeah.
So as I said, I had bought the 32 myself. I ended up paying like 85, 32 for it. But I was literally a week later gifted the 64.
Oh man, that's a good gift.
And apparently, like you said, Japan and America were kind of competing with prices.
Mm-hmm.
So the cut went from it was like almost close to like 180 for the 64 originally, and they cut it down to 120 to match the price of the 32.
Mm-hmm.
And it's all like, it was their way of saying, look, you can pay the same price, but you have more storage.
Yeah.
And then they had them in a bunch of bundles too.
Oh yeah, the Vita had so many bundles, especially like all over, like through the world, like not even with the limited edition ones. Like there was the Madden one, Call of Duty, Assassin's Creed ones. There were never like the obvious ones you would think of. There was never like an RPG bundle in the West or whatever. It was always for the games they thought were going to be like the big ones and stuff for it. Just curious though, has anyone in here bought or own like any of the special edition ones that Japan got? Yeah.
The Dragon Quest one.
Oh my God! Like if I didn't want to haul it around here, I would have gladly like brought that one. Like that, they knew that system was special. They made it for Dragon Quest builders, and like there's a ton of special edition Vitas in Japan and stuff for it. But the Dragon Quest one is really special. It literally comes in a treasure box. So it's all themed. The up button is a slime. The back is, so it's all like metallic silver. It's all for like the metal slime variant. So it's got a little metal slime on the back. There's even like a metal slime that can cling on to your aux cord area where you can just like hang on to it and stuff for it. It was such a really, really cool system. Like Japan, I always wanted to get more, but it was that thing of like, they were kind of cheap back then, but it was like, okay, how many Vitas does one man really need when you're really only using like your daily wood for it? And now all the prices for them have ballooned, but they're really cool. So Vita in 2012 though was its first real year, especially with it launching in the West. Sony was really committed to making everything as connected as possible. There were tons of apps. It launched with like Netflix, Facebook. Shout out to all people who used the rear touchpad to scroll Facebook. I hope I was not the only one. Skype, they tried to have as much of those apps that people used from the Vita onto the on the PSP to the Vita at launch, and it connected to the PC, PS3 really, really well. And this was also the same year they were introducing things like cross-buy, cross-play, cross-save. And if you were someone who owned PS3 and Vita, it was nice to just be like, hey, I bought PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale. I don't need to buy it twice. I've got both versions. Cross-save made it really, really nice to like work with things. And it was that thing of like, it's funny, it's kind of been lost now with PlayStation 4 to PlayStation 5 of like, is it free? How does it work? Is the upgrade a pain in the butt? Do I just need to stick my disc in? So it was a nice thing they eventually worked into. PS4 had it mostly just with cross-buy. PS4 later on never had any connectivity with the Vita, as sad early sign that they kind of gave up on it. But 2012 had a lot of really big games. We had like Little Big Planet, Persona 4 Golden, as most people probably know, was a really big one. Assassin's Creed, Call of Duty, Resistance, Gravity Rush, like so many games that like are still really, really special from that like launch year. And like, it was just funny because like it was just kind of like that launch, it was all over the place. There wasn't just like one or two genres like it really excelled in. And another big one that people I don't think talk about too much was PlayStation Plus getting added that November was such a huge one because PlayStation Plus at the time was a library. It was kind of like what they're doing now with Game Pass and stuff. They would just keep adding games to the PlayStation Plus collection. So they launched it with like 6 games, but it was like 6 really big games. Of if you got PlayStation Plus in November, it was also kind of an FU if you bought any of these games recently. Uncharted, Golden Abyss, that's a $50 game. Gravity Rush, that was like a $40 game. Wipeout, Jet Set Radio, and 2 other indie games I'm probably forgetting about, like Escape Plan. All of these really, really big games, and they kept adding on to it. Does anyone here have any games from like 2012 that like stick out to them of like, man, I really effed with that game, or like anything like that? Yeah.
Asphalt Injection, a racing game.
So I'm sure Asphalt's fine. The problem is like, I played Need for Speed Most Wanted before that. That was another like racer would have like Need for Speed was like the perfect port we would never get again if it was made by the actual team at Criterion, had all the features, all the other stuff for it. Whereas like I always looked at Asphalt as like the Game Loft game. I've never heard anything bad about it, but yeah, that was another like launch game I knew a lot of people like played a bunch. Yeah.
I'm not sure if it came out in 2012, but I really, really loved Rose of the Twilight.
That was a later one. Although Rose of the Twilight is always a really funny one for me. I remember as for all you guys in here, were you all more physical or digital with your Vita collections? That's a thing with Vita a lot, especially just because like they're like I have a game actually here right now. Unmetal only came out physically. So if you were one of the 2,500 people with it, there's no way to legally own this game digitally at all. And there were like so many just kind of perks to it, especially like we talked about with the memory and everything else like that. One of the funny things, because I don't meet that many Vita collectors who have as many physical games installed as I do, I came across this maybe like 2 or 3 years ago. Did you guys know there's a app limit on your Vita?
Yeah.
You can only have 500 bubbles. So I eventually got to a point where my Vita was like, I can't do this, Chief. And it's not like I can't do this, take it off. It's like, you got to hard reset me. I'm mentally not ready to like load up one more bubble. So it was one of those weird ones of like, I literally can't hold my and because if you'll remember, like, let's say if a game's like 2 gigs to download, you put in the physical, it's only going to be like 200 kilobytes or whatever. I have filled up my 64 gig with pretty much 99% physical bubbles only, outside of like a couple of random like games that have like huge updates like Senran Kagura or something like that. So I'm glad that most Vita people I meet are pretty much physical only. There is still a ton of really great digital only games, but we'll get to the whole digital versus physical in the later part of it. But PlayStation Plus was kind of that interesting push at the time of like, hey, if you are someone who likes digital only or maybe wants to try these games first, it was a really good kind of like middle ground of like, hey, here's a really good batch of games you can play without like sinking too much time into it. So 2012 didn't have like the strongest sales, but Sony was still committed to still making everything kind of work. They had a lot of exclusive planned, like I put up there. Tear Away from Media Molecule is a really great one I always recommend. Of like, it uses a lot of features without feeling boghorn or like a tech demo. Soul Sacrifice is less of a user-friendly kind of game, but for anyone out there who played or likes those Monster Hunter-like games, Soul Sacrifice is a really, really fun one. Sony had lots of plans in terms of working with devs. Working with indies was a big one. This was back when PlayStation actually cared about indie devs, as opposed to now where they just like, oh, whatever, you can come to us if you want. PS4 launched, didn't support it like PS3 did, as I mentioned, but the nice thing with it was for many years you saw a lot of games were cross-buy if it were digital. So something like Hotline Miami or Rogue Legacy, Spelunky, all those games that people would want to play would be like, hey, might not be the best version, but you just got a free version on the Vita. You can play with it and stuff like that. I think this also might have been, it was either 2012 or 2013. Has anyone here played Spelunky 1? So one of my favorite things that Spelunky had exclusively on the Vita was you could play LAN, which you could play co-op. And if you've ever played co-op Spelunky, it's absolute madness because you usually have to share the screen. But if you played Spelunky with a Vita, you didn't have to share the screen. So you could still co-op with your friends and venture off and not have to like be limited to like bouncing off the camera. And it was always like really fun to play it that way because it was like I loved playing Spelunky co-op, but it made you all die immediately faster because I'm going left, he's going right, all over the place, and then the ghost gets there, and it's craziness. But 2013, PlayStation was very eager to, I guess, kind of course correct because they thought, okay, the Vita's a solid idea. People who own it really, really like it. Why isn't it selling? So they did two things, and I have one of them listed here. They released the Vita TV. Who here actually owns or had owned a Vita TV at some point? That is, again, way more than I thought. I appreciate all of you for being here. Actually, who still has their Vita TV? Even more surprising. So the Vita TV launched in Japan, and it was basically their attempt of saying, okay, what if you hate going outside but want to play PlayStation Vita games? Well, I have half a good answer for you, because Sony was like, the Vita TV was a real, like, dirt cheap, like really, really cheap way to get into the Vita ecosystem. There was one critical flaw. Every game didn't work on it, though. You had to have games updated or whitelisted for it, and it had to, if it had touchscreen features, had to be patched in. Like some games, even if they could be played without touchscreens, needed a patch for it to work, like Super Monkey Ball. It's a primarily touch-focused game, but you could play it, but unless you whitelisted it yourself manually, you were just kind of stuck. So it was like a great console, but with just too many asterisks. I think that ended up making it being a little bit, it was eventually, it got to a point where, I don't know if people remember, it was marketed as like, hey, do you want to play your PS4 with remote play? Buy that. It was like, no one really, I assume no one really wanted it for that, but it was just a good idea for a console, but just really weird execution even in the West, in Japan. Still, a ton of exclusives were coming out from third party. Like I remember 2013, a big one was like Muramasa was a really, really fun one. A lot of like Western and Japanese games were coming out, and indie ones at the time. It was just like, I honestly like couldn't keep up. What was funny is like, even though I had my Vita in November of 2012, I really didn't think of myself as a collector for it till like 2015. And there was just such a backlog of stuff from like things people forget about. Like, yes, there's trash games like Ben 10 Galactic Racing, but then there's other weird ones like Sorcery Saga. Like all these are like niche RPGs, like NIS games. All these things like to really like flood the system. And as we skip ahead to 2014, something I kind of missed in Japan, but most people think of it as a 2014 thing, is barely a year and a half after the system had been out, Sony introduced a slim version. So the slim version was cheaper, thinner, replaced the OLED screen on the original with a cheaper LED screen, and basically the whole point of it was like, okay, we're going to make this as cheap as possible, strip out as much as we can, no more 3G option, and hope that people buy it. In the West, the Slim really felt like a little too late thing, but in Japan, the Slim really, really blew up. Of like, they bundled it with everything: visual novels, RPG, multiplayer stuff. Yeah.
The Slim also has 1 gig of final storage.
Yes, so that was the thing. Also, going back to the memory card thing, there was no internal storage on any of them. The Vita TV and the Vita Slim model all have at least 1 gig, meaning you can play something at least out of the box, which made it a lot more bearable. Does anyone here have the Slim one as like their primary one they like to use? Yeah.
I have a Glacier White Slim that I use, but I have a really weird issue with it. This is with every imported Japanese PSP Slim that I have. The left speaker is always shot.
Really? That's a weird one. That's a weird one I haven't had with it. But honestly, like all of my Slims, because they're just my collector's ones, I very rarely use them. So they're mostly just like to look for that. That's an issue, and I haven't heard of too much with it. But I will say, it was kind of interesting. Their switch from losing the OLED screen, while definitely made sense because OLED screens were really expensive even back in 2012, that was kind of one of those things that made the Vita special. And like, it's not the highest resolution screen out there, but they still look really good by today's standards. Like when you look at a game that really like uses that screen, or like 2D art really pops and really shines, or even like playing like older PSP and PS1 games on it, that screen does make a difference. And like, as people who have like the Switch OLED will know, even if you're playing games at the same old resolution, having that nicer like screen that's brighter colors, darker darks, everything like that, it was a tough one of like, man, there were like a lot of benefits. Also, they changed the charging port, so that wasn't proprietary anymore. Like the Slim had almost everything going in its favor. Like if it wasn't for the fact that it had that screen loss, I would probably have switched over because like they are legitimately thinner. Like Vitas are pretty chunky as they are with like how much they crammed in there. But does anyone like prefer the OLED versus the Slim model? Because I always feel like it's really like kind of split down the middle. Yeah.
Honestly, I think the OLED is great because it's Reno, but for a certain less legal means, the Slim is significantly easier.
Oh yeah. And also another one I forgot to include was recent. It had a bigger battery. I think the Vita battery is pretty fine as it is, but it is one of those things of longer battery is also a big one for portable stuff of like, we're living in a time now where Steam Deck and Switch, you're lucky to get more than 3 hours on these systems and stuff for it. But back then, when comparing it to the DS, that would last like 12 or something hours, 6 was low. So having 7 or maybe 9 was like a big deal there with it. Yeah.
I think the only reason I prefer my regular Vita versus the Slim is because it's bigger. Play football with big chunky hands, press all the buttons at once type of thing. It's not a fun thing for me back then.
No, yeah, that's true.
I was very, very frustrated by that. And then again, memory space.
Yeah.
It's kind of a wish wash because there are things I really like about the OLED model and then the LED. Well, I like the ergonomics of the LED one just because the OLED, for whatever reason, if I hold it a certain way, it kind of cramps my hands a bit. But it's just the screen is just. I'm so used to the OLED screen that playing the same games on that screen is just, I can do it, but it's not the same.
Yeah, no, I definitely get that. And yeah, the real estate definitely makes a difference when you're kind of there with it. Unfortunately, 2014 is when Sony in America was just kind of like, we gave you 3 years, guys. We're kind of packing it up here. Like Freedom Wars was their last big attempt. They had like a handful of titles that year where they put a lot of effort into marketing really big. Was like Freedom Wars, I don't know why these two, The Walking Dead Season 2 and Wolf Among Us, God bless them, and Minecraft. Minecraft was a really, really big one because at the time, that was the way to play Minecraft portably. Like, yes, Minecraft was on, like, iPhone, but this was Minecraft's analog stick, touchscreen. It was the best way to play it portably for many, many years and ended up selling an insane amount of copies worldwide and was one of those fun ones of... I knew it was actually, funnily enough, I got the port really, really late. America was the only country, for some reason, where we had it available physically, but it was that stupid code in a box. Where it's like, here's the box, you dumb nerds, but you don't actually want the cart. I did want the cart. Europe got it, Australia got it, Japan got it, and it was one of those things that I just sat on forever because there was millions of copies of Minecraft on Vita. But it was just one of those things that when I finally got around to play, I was like, oh yeah, even in like by 2020 standards, like Minecraft on Vita was like a super solid way to like play that game. And yeah, Sony was just like, okay, at least in the West, we're going to pretty much rely on this as a indie thing and Japanese games can come to it. But they kind of were like, okay, we're not going to sync any more AAA. You're not going to get Infamous on there, which actually stinks as there was a plan originally from the Uncharted Golden Abyss devs to make a Infamous spinoff, but it just never got off the ground. There were so many canceled Vita games because Sony in the West pulled out. It just really, really stinks. But thankfully, I'm sure a lot of us in the room will agree, Japan definitely picked up a lot of the slack. So many titles that we ended up getting either late or on time. It is funny, like when people will be like, oh, what do you remember the Vita for? People will be like, oh yeah, there are the exclusives, there is Persona 4, but like when I think of the Vita, I think of all the really weird games. Like the games people don't think about necessarily, like I think of Galgun, I think of like Muv-Luv, Utawara Ramono, Lost Dimension, all these really just like kind of out there games that may even still only be on that system. And 2015 was kind of like that start of, okay, the Vita's niche, but we're going to try. Most stores stopped stocking it, so really if you were like, unless you were GameStop or a Kmart clearance bin or something, you weren't going to find Vita stuff very often. And this is like where I got into collecting Vita myself of like, okay, things are getting cheap, stuff is still coming out at retail, so I can still support the system and have fun with it, and there was a lot of weird things. I'm curious, who here got into the Vita, like, pretty much after it had died? Like, who here got into it, like, kind of late? Like, what year did you finally get it?
2017.
And so what, were you just like sitting there going like, you know what, forget this Switch, man. I got to get this Vita now.
Well, the main reason was I wanted to play Shantae Half Genie Heroes.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't have enough money for anything else to play it except the Vita stuff. So.
That is like such a funny one of like, I love that version of Half Genie Hero, and it sucks because every other Shantae could have ran on the Vita. Way Forward made so many games on the Vita. Most people forget they actually did the only Silent Hill game. They did Book of Memories. That was the Shantae devs. Like, they did Boy and His Blob. They had so many things they supported, but they're like, no, we'll just do the Kickstarter Shantae and then leave all the other ones on 3DS and everything else. So that's like a funny one of like, I think the Vita is like perfect for something like Shantae, but there's only one, and it kind of like syncs up. Anyone else who got into the system like really late? Yeah, you.
Yeah, we got in around 2018, like right before GameStop was like really trying to push out figures everything out.
Do you remember when you got it? Because that would have been like peak, like people are trying to get rid of them for like $60, $80 or whatever price.
Oh man, I feel like it probably was around summertime then, but yeah, I felt like it was a pretty good time to jump in.
Mm-hmm. Was there like a specific game, or were you like, oh, right place, right time?
It was the right place because yeah, we got it at the pawn shops and we're like 2 Vitas, why not? And then all of a sudden I'm like paying attention to all the games. I'm like, oh damn, this system's actually pretty damn cool.
Yeah, it's got like one of the weirdest libraries because it's like, yeah, people will be like, it's good for RPGs or it's good for visual novels, but like, no, man, you gotta comb through it. Like, there's I think one of the nice things about the system being as niche as it is there's not a lot of trash. Like, there's not a lot of games where, like, it's not flooded with sports games. It got a couple of FIFA, a couple of rugbies, but unless you're like, I only like racing games, there's not a lot of genres that go ignored. And even the racing games that are on it, like, I love, like I mentioned, Need for Speed, Sonic Racing Transformed is, like, really, really good on there. It just covers, like, so many different weird ones. There was another person in the back who else in the back got into the Vita really late and wanted to share? Yeah.
I got into it like 2017. I just wanted to try it out. My friend is a really big like PlayStation fan. He like swears by me, and I was like, oh, I'll try it out. It's a really good system. I really love it. I had like a card in it. I played like the old Alpha on there.
Yeah, and like I feel like there are so many things, like I could really go on for like 2 or 3 hours with just getting into games or let alone features. Like a big one for me was like trophies. Was like this was a way you could get trophies on the go or play these games, and that was like so many things of like I remember telling people it would be funny if like the reasons I would get people into the system, they were never like equal or for the same. Like I have 2 very different games from 2015 listed of Persona 4 Dancing All Night and Danganronpa. Danganronpa was a weird one for me of it's funny, it's like I think Danganronpa got popular in the West because of the Vita, but people don't remember it was like a Vita exclusive for a really, really long time. And I'm just curious, who in here got into Danganronpa by playing the Vita ones? So shout out to if you like Ultra Despair Girls. It's like one of my favorites, like right up there with V3 of just like really weird, but like it was just so funny of this weird visual novel that started on the PSP, finally got ported over. It was so nice to see it actually succeed in the West on the Vita because it seemed like something that shouldn't have really happened. Yeah.
I loved it because you got to finally kill Monokuma.
Yeah, it was basically if you want to experience Resident Evil 4 with Danganronpa characters, that was Ultra Despair Girls. Yeah.
It was funny that you mentioned Danganronpa. I actually had originally played it through an English translated PSP, and it just came out of a random recommendation. And the only reason I bought it on the Vita was just because I wanted to see more support for Danganronpa going forward.
Well, that was the thing, because at the time, visual novels were so few and far between over here. Like when I ask you guys, like, what do you think of for series of early Western visual novels we got? Like I think of 999, but even 999, like not a lot of people really played until like Virtue's Last Reward and stuff. Yeah. Yeah, Ace Attorney, but like even then, like remember how we had to beg for Ace Attorney? Like it was like we were like barely getting them.
I think I don't know if anybody in the room is familiar with Hakuoki. It's a because they got a release on the PSP. I couldn't tell you what.
I think the PSP one was like the action game. Like we got like a couple.
There was an action game, and then there was the actual visual novel, and I don't remember which came first and which came later, but that was about probably not as early as I can think of.
Yeah. I guess I care to say, who here does not like visual novels and still has the Vita? I always just kind of assumed like they're all kind of tied together because it really is like the RPG and visual novel machine for a large audience. Like if you look at the games that are on like Vita exclusives in Japan, for the last couple of years, it was pretty much just those two genres. But it is always like funny of like, if it wasn't for the Vita, I probably wouldn't be into like visual novels the way I am now, because I was always like, I wasn't that into the idea, but ironically, I got a free copy of Danganronpa 2, and that's what got me hooked. And then looking into everything else with it, which was nice because there are so many different hybrids and stuff out there for it. So, like I mentioned, 2015, Japan is supporting it with a lot more games. They're slowly making their way over to the West, but it's really, at this point, becoming the niche game machine. Question for anyone out there who might remember, does anyone know what was the first limited print game that came out in 2015 for the Vita? I'll give you a hint. It's not limited run. It was sold through Fangamer. Has anyone here? Yeah.
Wasn't Undertale? Was that 2016?
No, that was 2016. I remember that because I was actually at E3 when they announced it, and I was the guy in my theater who freaked out about Undertale coming to Vita. Everyone else was like, I don't know what this is. No, it was Retro City Rampage. Had gotten originally a physical version limited for like 2,000 or 3,000 copies on PS4, and then that was the first one that started. But most people remember limited like releases for the Vita starting with limited run games. They did Breach and Clear. That was the only game they did in 2015. 2016, as we'll get into here, I kind of wrap up 2016, 17, and 18 in one, because really it had a lot of big releases, but it was kind of the same thing happening of not a lot of news, niche releases, games happening, some games not, a lot of Kickstarters. Geez, I could have had a whole page on Vita Kickstarters that failed. But the fun thing about this year was like the weird breadth of games that were coming out. Like I put up there, Ys 8, I think is one of the most underappreciated like AAA games on there. Falcom was hitting it. So many different genres were just being like represented of like crazy things like we were seeing from Japan. But then also the nice thing is we were seeing these, for all the physical collectors out there, all these different companies opening up like limited runs, signature edition, strictly limited, East Asia Soft, Red Art Games, all these things, very bad at naming. They all just wanted to copy each other in terms of names. But just curious, who here was a collector who ended up either buying these, importing these? How many like rare, like limited print games did anyone else here collect? Because that was the fun thing of like, I knew people who'd have the Vita, but when I was like, cool, if you want this game, wake up at 9 a.m. on Friday and you might have a chance to buy it, was usually the hurdle that scared off most of my friends who were collecting. So I was wondering, does anyone here collect any of those like rarer games, anything like that?
I guess I have some like PlayAsia or limited run exclusives, but like some I haven't played, like Curse of Castilla EX, I think I got from Vita.
Oh, that was like a funny one of like, that one's really rare now. Like the PlayAsia stuff lasted way longer than anyone I think would have expected, but like every now and then there will be a title that like just sold out really fast or went really rare. Curse Castilia is one that I know is really rare. Another one that I always am amazed at how horrifyingly expensive it is there's a indie game called Back in 1995. It basically plays like a old PlayStation 1 Silent Hill or Resident Evil like game. Looks like those old graphics. Had like maybe 1,500 of them or whatever. Goes for like $500 a copy. Because it's like, speaking of genres that didn't get a lot of representation, strict survival horror, there's not a lot of on the Vita, especially 3D polygonal stuff. Like if you were looking for something Silent Hill-esque, especially at the time, there's not a lot of it out there. So like there are those examples of, that's why these like smaller print runs were so brilliant of like, it sucks if you want to buy and play it legally, but when you have them, it is like the way I have like my Vita collection set up. It is all the limited stuff is by company in order. So I am a stupid person, and I own every limited run game. I own every cover variant from collector's editions to PAX exclusives to PlayAsia stuff, because a lot of them, for me, I was like, if I had like a 1% chance of owning this game physically, I would rather jump through those hoops than like buy it like really cheap digitally. And there were just so many different titles that like I loved having a chance to own. Like I mentioned, Spelunky, Undertale got one, although thankfully Undertale was very common because everyone loves Undertale, or most people, I would hope, really, really like Undertale. So many fun exclusives kind of were releasing because devs got to the point where the PlayStation Store was such a mess of, like, I don't know if people remember, the Vita Store just kind of existed but never got updated. New games were there, but they never maybe updated the store. The store was broken. So if you wanted to find a game, you'd have to go out of your way, search it up manually, and pray to God you found it, and the store link didn't break. So devs kind of gave up on the digital games, but because this collector's market was there, even printing 2,000 or 3,000 copies, you could still make your money back. And it funded a lot of games that we normally wouldn't see. That's why something like Muv-Luv, the only reason Muv-Luv happened was because of a Kickstarter that added it at like the last second. Like Muv-Luv almost didn't come out legally in the West and also had a stupidly long production cycle of almost happening, not happening, what was up with it. But I just want to kind of see, like, were there any games you all would have wanted to see physically and were kind of bummed never happened? Because now that the cutoff's out, nothing outside of 1 or 2 games we'll talk about at the end, no Vita surprises are going to happen anymore. Digital games can't come out anymore. Physical games can't come out. So were there any games you guys all wanted physically and were bummed never came out? Yeah.
Even though it kind of technically did, I'm bummed out that Binding of Isaac didn't get publicly
I have done so much digging into the Nicalis thing of it. Yeah, there are copies of Binding of Isaac out there. When last year some dude found it at, I think, like a Ohio pawn shop for like $16, I'm like, man, what a random gold mine of a find. And like, I know they'll release eventually, but yeah, that's like such a funny one of like, it's Binding of Isaac. Also, Nicalis doesn't have a lot of IP that they milk as much as stuff like Binding of Isaac. So you think if you have 2,000 copies of Binding of Isaac, not even the new one, the one from 2013, they're not like going to put new stuff in it. So it's like you're going to sell the old, like, that's such a weird bonehead one of like, I don't know what they were thinking with that. But ones that always stand out for me, Rogue Legacy. I was like, that game was so big at the time. Hotline Miami is a weird half yes, half no. Hotline Miami never got a physical in English. In Japan, it actually got a physical published by Spike Chunsoft with 1 and 2. Only 1's on the cart. 2 was a downloadable because that seemed hard to include both at the time. So like, there's always like weird little releases of like things I wanted, or you would think this is an obvious. Like a big one was Bastion by the guys who did Hades. Bastion was this hugely popular game back in the 360 era. The only reason we got a physical of Bastion was because when Sony announced in 2018 that they were going to cut off physical production, they were like, oh, we should do that. The last second, they're like, oh, you know what? Let's wait till the last minute, because they thought we can do it. It doesn't. We've got all these things in production. It doesn't really matter. But it was funny that like when that cutoff finally happened, all these developers kind of took 1 or 2 stance of like, okay, cool, the system's dead to us now. Like that's what Atlas did, funnily enough. The Persona 3 and 5 dancing game were announced at E3 2018 as digital only, and everyone was like, why is it digital only? Like, you're one of the companies people think of for the Vita. Why wouldn't you do it physically? And they're like, well, production's cut off. We don't really want to mess with that anymore. Even though you saw all of these companies jump through hoops to get games like Deathmark or shout out to NIS America. Like they actually, Ys 8 was supposed to be their last physical Vita game. And when Sony announced the cutoff date, they were like, okay, let's go back and see what we had digitally only and go back. That's how we got things like Lost Child, Penny Punching Princess, half-minute heroes, stuff like that, or 30-second hero. And I really appreciate like those companies who were like, okay, we don't have a lot of time, it's going to be rushed, it's going to be a small print run, it's going to be annoying and messy, but let's make it happen. And I think that's like always been the attitude with Vita of like, there's not a lot of us, but the dozens of us out there, we will do what we can to make it as financially profitable for you as possible. So 2019 was kind of like the beginning of the end in the West. Of spring 2019 was the cutoff. So if you wanted a game with an ESRB logo or a European logo, it had to be produced and printed by then. And what's really funny, as we mentioned with Binding of Isaacs, there's at least 4 games right now that were printed in 2019 that are done Still not released. There is VVVVV, 1001 Spikes, Binding of Isaac through Nicalis, and then limited run games. I'd be curious what you all think of this, since not a lot of people are out there. Limited run, because they were one of the first big ones of like, we have numbered releases. Like, so if you look at a limited run game, on the spine in the back, there's like a number associated to it. So limited run canonically did 101 PlayStation Vita games, independent, on their own. If you own every single one of them, you got a special, well, hypothetically, they've never shipped them out. If you own all 101 limited run games, you would get a special exclusive game for like kind of having like a full set collection. And I was always like curious of like, because the reaction to that was interesting, of people being like, what the hell? I have to buy all of your random indie games to get this one game. It ended up being revealed. It's a game called Revenge of the Bird King. It's like a NES style Mega Man like 8-bit game. It's really fun. Like I have it. It's like, I like it, but it's not a game. No one's gonna go to your house, but like, bro, you got Revenge of the Bird King? Like, it's not gonna be like this crazy collector's item down the line. Like, there are rarer games, there are more popular games with it. But I'm curious, like, how did you guys ever feel about like the idea of these physical games that were rare and basically borderline impossible to get? Like, was that anything you guys ever like liked, hated, appreciated? Yeah.
So I love limited run, but I've noticed that a lot of the games come to Amazon and they're not that expensive. Like, they're not as expensive as I was expecting them to be. Like Nerf's Love Addiction, that's like $119 for the collector's edition on Amazon, and I paid $129 on limited run. Yeah,
the funny thing is with a lot of those LRG things, especially, and Vita stuff in general, is 90% of their stuff goes for below market value. Like, a lot of it is outside of the few games you'll see, like a River City Girls or like some earlier stuff like Breach and Clear or Oddworld. A lot of these games, like if it's through like a somewhat well-known indie game, most of like their stuff you can still get for like $20 or $30. So if there is a game you ever missed out physically on the Vita and it was through limited run, go to eBay. There's a lot of people who are just desperate to get rid of their stock. So especially if you're not a sealed collector, which thankfully I'm not a sealed collector. I open all of my stuff up. It's nice that like when I know people who are like, oh man, I wish I got like this random RPG back, and they'd be like, here you go, here's an eBay link. Some guy's desperate to get rid of it. Yeah.
Luckily with limited run, a lot of times, I think over half of the ones I have, and now maybe this isn't true for Vita, it is nowadays with Switch, that Best Buy will carry them.
Yes, yeah, Best Buy, and there were so many things, like you mentioned in the back, them going on Amazon, like so many different ways to just make it more accessible. Because like the thing is, like, I always liked the idea of limited run, but yeah, from a you're going to get rich quick scheme from it, yeah, it's never worked that much for like the games that are rare on it. Don't really make sense. Like their rarest Vita game, I think, ironically, is Bloodstained: Curse of the Moon. So if anyone out there remembers, Bloodstained was a Kickstarter game, basically, hey, let's make Castlevania, but not call it Castlevania. They made a Vita version, because originally Bloodstained was actually another failed Kickstarter project. Bloodstained proper was supposed to be on Vita. The prequel game, which looks like a old like Castlevania 3 style game, that got a super, super late limited run release. That on its own, I think, goes for like over $150, let alone with the collector's edition, stuff like that for it. So it's the titles you don't really think about. Like a game that looks like an NES game that is sold for like $5 if you want a physical version. No manual, no nothing that crazy with it. It's going to be hundreds of dollars, whereas like there are games like Undertale, which comes with like a nice hard, like literally like it has a book for an instruction manual. Like the things like that never really correlate to value the way that you can probably safely predict. So just because the production cut off, though, like I said, in 2019, digital games still could come out, but as we mentioned, the store was still a mess, so you didn't really see a lot. There was a lot of those like $4 and under games. They're like, hey, some random company in Russia ported some indie game you've probably never heard of off itch, put an easy platinum on it, and then you could go from there. The games were really ranging in quality, but it was a thing of like, it was nice that they were still there. There were still a couple of teams who kept things ticking. 2020 is where things got extra weird. Shortly after 2020 started, Sony announced that Japan physical production was ending. And when it was announced in the West, like I mentioned, it was a mad dash to, okay, we'll print as many games as humanly possible. Japan was the opposite. There was one publisher still printing games, and it was East Asia Soft. And they pretty much got all of the cards all to their own because everyone was like, it's cool. You're good. You can take all the cards. The last retail game in Japan was actually a NIS game. We got over here. I always forget what it's called. It's like Labyrinth of Refrain something. It's like a sequel to like a top-down dungeon crawler. Just never got it. Japan had it was a game that was delayed a bajillion times, and like 2 visual novels. I always forget what they were, but they're like your typical like TNA. You're not going to think about it very long. Visual novels. So for retail, Japan had nothing exciting happen. No companies wanted to do anything that crazy. So East Asia Soft basically got a horde of games, and it was like, okay, if you couldn't do it with limited run, go do it with us now because this is your last chance. And we saw a lot of really interesting, probably not popular for what you would think of, but the other game I put on there was Twin Breaker. It is a game that is based in the universe of a PlayStation podcast, and it plays like Pong. So it's just a lot of little weird games out there. Unmetal is a great one, like I mentioned. If you like classic Metal Gear, not Metal Gear Solid, 2D Metal Gear, Unmetal is a fan love letter to that genre. There's a lot of really cool games that came from it, and thankfully the East Asia Soft kind of got rarer later on. People who've bought from both will know buying a game from limited run was stressful. Most stuff through Play Asia, you could wake up, be 2 or 3 minutes late. And until those couple of final releases, most of them was a pretty easy experience, and picking them up was fun. And the library was really weird. You'd get stuff like visual novels, 2D platformers, sometimes games that were basically demos. There were just a lot of weird stuff out there. A couple people were still sticking around. Japan did nothing digital. They gave up on digital a really, really long time. But a couple of devs were still sticking around even after 2020, because then in 2021 we found out Sony, and I didn't really know how to list this because it's kind of confusing. You guys remember last year Sony announced they were shutting down the PlayStation 3 and Vita store. And everyone lost their minds. They were like, oh my God, PS3 and Vita stuff's going to be rare. Buy it all up physically. Buy all the trash games off Amazon. Charge $50 for Hatsune Miku for some reason now. So digital stuff got as rare as it could be. Physical stuff absolutely ballooned in price for no reason. And it's just English stuff. All the Japanese stuff is still really, really cheap. So people were freaking out because they thought, okay, the store's going to get shut down and all these hundreds and hundreds of games will never be accessible again. And then there was a handful of devs who were still working on Vita games who then had 6 weeks to finish their games or try to or cancel them. And most of the final games that ended up coming out are not really that worth of consequence or note. A lot of them really either had to get canned or it was just, hey, here's what we had that was ready. But there were a couple of fun releases that did thankfully come out, and a big notable one that I have on here is Russian Subway Dogs. I'm forgetting the dev's name who made this, but it's a really fun, really cheap game. You can still download it on Vita right now. It's only available on Vita. He's working on a port for PC, all the other consoles, but he'd been working on this game on his own, like a one-man dev team for years, and he was like, okay, drop everything. I'm going to get this version out because I have to. And it was really nice of when it did, it was content complete. It didn't feel like it was rushed. It's a full game. It's a really fun, little arcadey style. You're this dog who just barks at people in Russian subways to get meals, and it's a fun little arcade game that you can pick up and play for 15 minutes or 2 hours. There's lots of cute stuff with it. It was nice that it wasn't okay, here's a bunch of shovelware that we're dumping out before. So it was nice that at least that final send-off of summer 2021 had something good to keep on the store. But it was then interesting because the market kind of imploded, because also, as I'm sure you are all aware, when quarantine happened, video game collecting just spiked in prices. So when you could go and buy something like Little Deviants for $5, now it's going to be $15. Or something like a Hyperdimension Neptunia 1 might be $40 before is going to go for $100 now. So the tough part is now in 2022, I still recommend the Vita to anyone I think might be interested in it, but there's so many little weird caveats of, okay, it used to just be the memory card, but now it's the systems are more expensive now. The games are hard to come by. If you're doing it or if you're getting stuff digitally, it's less so in terms of a challenge, but for people out there, I'm sure, how many people in here have either modded or homebrewed their Vita? So, like, it's a great way to, like, enjoy the system without a lot of those, like, caveats. But, like, the funny thing for me is, like, I know there's a lot of cool stuff in the homebrew community for Vita now. I have a disgusting backlog of games I've never played. It's like, as much as I love looking at it, like, there have been ports, like, native ports of GTA, Vice City, San Andreas, all, like, Doom. Any game, like, actually a really cool one. I don't know if it ever got completed, but a guy is porting by hand Cuphead to Vita natively, and it's running, and it's been really cool, like, watching, like, the community is still alive. Even though we can't officially put games on the Vita anymore, it's really cool to just kind of watch it still exist. It's nice that the store is at least up for now. Physical stuff is still there. We still have that community. It's obviously lasted way longer than Sony would have ever thought. I mean, Sony, like I said, gave up on it in 2014, and it's 2022, and people still play their Vita. They still, like, are excited to play things on their Vita. Outside of this year being really busy with me for Switch, the Vita was, like, my daily thing of, like, yeah, I'd play it for 10, 15 minutes, get a couple of things, or go through games, review them, checking them out like that. And it's been over 10 years. It has over 1,300 different games on it. The backlog is crazy. It's got one of the weirdest histories, lineups, and it's just kind of nice where it's, like, people kind of refer to it a lot of, like, it's the Dreamcast 2 of, like, how collectors and fans will remember it, how unpopular it was with the mainstream. But the nice thing about it was, like, the Dreamcast died really quickly. Like, the Dreamcast has, like, a lot of games, but it doesn't have hundreds of games. Whereas the Vita was kind of nice of, like, okay, it sucks you had to die, but it's nice that it took us 10 years for you to die. Like, I don't think, like, in 2012, I would not have thought I would still care about this system as much as I do now. But I think it goes to the games that are on it, the community who likes the Vita, and also just the fact that, like, it's a really good, piece of technology. Like, it's still fun to play. I personally find it more comfortable to play portably than my Switch. Nothing against my Switch, but it's just, like, it just ticked all of those right boxes, even though it was trying to do way too many things, way too much all the time. But either way, that is me pretty much a little over an hour. I want to thank all of you guys. I expected 2 of you to come here. I'm glad it was more than 2 who actually arrived. So thank you all for sitting down, listening to me ramble for over an hour, talking about the Vita. If you guys have anything else you want to yell at me, please feel free to come up. Like I said, I have way too many Play Asia order stickers, so if you want a kind of cute free sticker, please come up and steal them all as much as you want. I also have a random Danganronpa keychain or acrylic you can take that I just threw to the floor. Person running, you definitely earned dibs with that one, so please take it. But yeah, he's from 3, not V3, but he's the guy from the anime of 3. But yeah, so thank you guys all for coming and sitting down. I really appreciate it.